How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'd like you to be up on the screen with me.
I don't know why that's not so, but I am here in the house.
I can see you, a little picture of you. There you are.
Okay. How it's such a blessing and honor to be with you this morning.
You too.
Hmm.
I'm honored. Well, if you want to get started, we might as well, while they work through the issues.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, I'm excited about these next few minutes that we're going to be sharing when we're going to talk about writing your fearless truth, because these are certainly times that demand that we as writers come out of a place of fear and intimidation and write a truth that might be unique to these times. So, Martha, I'm going to ask you, when have you been, what does it mean to you to write your fearless truth? Can you tell us what that might look like for you, and maybe in an instance where you've had to do that or someone else has had to do that?
Well, I found this title interesting, Telling Your Fearless Truth, because, there are three major issues in that little tiny title. First is the expression itself. What form are you going to take? For me, it's always been writing. I was nonverbal as a child and dyslexic, so verbal language was not something that was easy for me. And then fearless, your fearless truth. I think that that's a fascinating issue to delve into, is our fears, because our fears more than anything hold us back from our potential and who we came here to be and the change that we can affect by being fearless. And then the truth, our individual truth. What I have learned from writing is that what I write the first time oftentimes is what I've been taught to believe. And so when you write that and then you go back the next day or whenever and read over what you've written, you realize, wait a minute, that might be what I was taught, but that isn't what I believe. And every time you rewrite and you revise and you go deeper and deeper to really try to get to the essence of what your truth is. So I see that this is three parts. And for people who might have a hard time starting to tell your truth, your fearless truth, the next time you stay quiet, even though you have something to say, but for whatever reason you don't speak up, start there. If fear is keeping you quiet and you can feel that fearfulness that is sort of has a clamp over your lips, start there. Or if you don't know what your truth is, it's like, I don't know what I stand for. I don't know what I care passionately enough about to speak fearlessly about. Start there. So I did that for myself, really, trying to find my truth and to speak it fearlessly. And I've got to tell you, it took me most of my life to get here. I would say in the last couple of years, I've been able to really own my own story, my truth. Holding on to secrets is something that is just toxic and deadly. And yet it's something that so many of us struggle with, that we were told not to tell, or we're too afraid to tell because of the repercussions or whatever. So I was able to do that with both my novel that just came out and the workbook that's up for, to win in the contest. So anyway, it was, and what about for you, Rev? I know you've had a fascinating life, and I wonder how that was for you to speak your truth.
Well, first of all, I find that speaking your truth, it frees you, not only frees the society around you, it frees you. James Baldwin is one of my favorite authors. And James Baldwin wrote to free himself. He wanted to find out things about himself, to unleash chambers in his inner soul that had been hidden and closed off to not only the world, but to himself. And so I find that when you speak the truth, Jesus said, you will know the truth and the truth shall make you free. He said, it'll make you free. So before you can free others, you have to free yourself. I read a book some years ago called The War of the Bloods in My Veins. and it was by Deshaun Jawi Morris, who was a known blood shot caller. He was a gang shot caller, and he had an opportunity to go to college because he was an athlete, and he was headed toward pro football stardom and fame. But he took his lifestyle with him to the college, and he got in trouble, and he ended up in a cell. And in that cell, he began to write. He began to think about the fact that he had thrown away a multi-million-dollar career that could have extricated himself and his family from poverty. And in the darkness, in that dank, a smelly place with vermin running all around him, he began to scribble on a piece of paper. And he wrote a book called The War of the Bloods in My Veins, which became a bestseller. And so I found when I work with people in the inner city that one of the greatest healing tools is the freedom of bringing out the truth within yourself with the pad and the pen. Personally, in my life, as a writer, I'm able to reach people that I would have never been able to reach as a minister, as an inner city minister, because many of the people that I reach as a writer are incarcerated. So I can't go to them, but my books can go to them. So that's I found that there's a freedom in releasing people from certain choices and debilitating behaviors and decisions that they make, that you can give people as a writer choices that free us. So that's kind of how I've started in that journey as a fiction writer. Especially, I write in several different genres, but as a fiction writer, I'm always seeking to extricate people from pain, post-traumatic stress disorder, and from negative choices.
Wow, that's great. Yeah, and I think what's fascinating about all of this, because I've thought about it a lot, knowing that we were going to speak together, but just how expressing yourself on any level leaves you so vulnerable and sort of fragile, because whatever comes up onto the page, or whatever our mode of expression happens to be, it's coming from such a deep personal place, and we have to learn how to not only speak our fearless truth, but to be able to anticipate and protect ourselves from what may come from that. I've spent most of my career empowering women's voices. I did that with plot in writing fiction, memoir, and screenplays, because most female authors at the time when I was starting out didn't know about plot. It wasn't something that was taught. It was thought it would interfere with creative writing. And so, but I think that what's equally important is to anticipate that you may not even be heard. You may be ridiculed for what you think and believe. The more you go up against the status quo or the way things have always been and try to present something new and different, there is going to be pushback. And we have to use that to strengthen ourselves and to feel like, oh, I hit a nerve. This is working, because, there is this pushback. There is this reaction. So I think it's important that we use fearlessness as a form of protection, that we see that as our, the way that we can be strong is through our fearlessness. And, it doesn't have to be big. We don't have to be doing what everyone else is doing. You can write probe words and mess around and write a simple haiku or a poem that can change the world. It can move people to action or to feelings or whatever. So it's really about telling your fearless truth and then standing behind it.
I so agree. I write urban fiction books. Urban fiction is a genre that's been around for a long time, but in the late 80s, early 90s, it really exploded with the release of a book called The Coldest Winter Ever by Sister Souljah. And so these books are written for people who have street experiences. They're written to kids who have seen violence and lived in the inner city. And so when I would talk to young people, and I would talk to them and try to find an opening to, help them to create a bridge between myself and somebody who was lost in the streets. And I realized that they'd all read The Coldest Winter Ever or another book called True to the Game by Terry Woods. And so I was speaking to kids who are deeply enmeshed in the underground drug culture, human trafficking, kids who were born into the streets where their parents or grandparents even might have been involved in the illicit drug culture. And so I wanted to reach them, and I found a way. And that was to create a book called Straight Out of East Oakland, not straight out of East Oakland, straight out of East Oakland. And so when I created this book, I created it in a pathway, in a framework that anybody from the streets would understand. And it was to give people a choice. And it talked about retribution. It also talked about the power of education. But when you look at the cover of the book, it's got a man with sunglasses pointing a shotgun at the potential reader. Well, when I wrote that book, Straight Out of East Oakland, Oakland is very territorial. And even though the name sometimes for some is notorious, people guard that name. I asked a young person who from the streets, if I had written this book and it didn't come true to the streets that you live in, what would have happened? He said, "Oh, somebody would have killed you." Because they took it that, so to write that book with that title was to put my life on the line. The second thing I think about, I wrote this book, it's called Taking It to the Streets, Lessons from a Life of Urban Ministry. I was on the radio. This book is about the failure of the church in the inner city to really reach out and help the young people and people who are caught up in human trafficking, which is a huge problem in Oakland where I live, and the street culture. And so the church has, even though there are churches on every single block in the hood, the church has not made it its mission to provide food on a large scale, to provide counsel, to really make itself accessible to people who are really needed. So I wrote this book and I went on a radio show and I talked about why the ministers had failed the community and how that had happened. After I wrote that, one of the most powerful ministers, if not the most powerful minister in Oakland, went on social media and he called me a traitor.
Whoa!
In the most colorful terms that one could use. And the fact that I used my voice to make a clarion call for change separated me from the faith community, because other preachers came on to that same platform and they called me everything but the child of God, and they refused to let me be in their churches anymore after I made that statement. So
they're afraid of the truth.
When you speak that truth, you have to be prepared for what comes with it.
That's so true. It's so true. And yet it's so important, because it's like, Oakland is right next door to, well, now I'm in Santa Cruz, and it's like it's closed. The door is slammed shut. We don't really see into that reality and that whole world. So it's an exciting time with the protests and Black Lives Matter and bringing all of this to the fore. And yet it is causing all kinds of chaos, because people don't want to have to deal with what's difficult, what's uncomfortable, what we've been able to hide from or pretend wasn't there. And so, I just think of so many women my age who haven't spoken up enough. It's we don't grow and change and become our true potential by staying silent, by sweeping the problems under the rug. Oh, everything's going to be okay. Oh, don't talk about that. Oh, whatever it is, the more of us that do speak up and make our voices heard, the more, we can change the world. But it's not going to change without us. It takes every single one of us to be brave. And that's really what it is fearlessness, is, to be able to handle it when your heart is beating really fast and your hands are sweating and you're really scared, and that, that you're going to hear about it in one way or another and be punished like what you were. But even within our own families, and our friends and everywhere else. So I think now we're being confronted by one challenge after another after another. It's almost like the cauldron is so hot beneath us that we now know that it's time. And so it's just up to us to be courageous and to speak out and do it, with pride and belief in the power of change and the power of people and people's compassion and their willingness to do what is right, and when they hear the truth for all time, it resonates. If you talk about what's true for right now, that's one thing. But when you talk about the truth, that resonates with everyone, and it fires all of us up and inspires us to do what we didn't think we could. But every time we do it, every time we speak up and own our own truth, I can say this from personal experience, it is really powerful. It makes you so much stronger and so much more willing to get out there and just say what needs to be said.
You're you're so right. The other night I asked how many people remember when the night they heard that George Floyd had been murdered. And I asked, do you remember where you were at that particular moment? Because many of our lives changed. There was a truth that we'd grown up with that collided with the reality of the world the way it is for people of color that night. And that led many, when I walked out into the protests, been an activist in the Bay Area for years. When I walked out into those protests, I began to see Asian kids, white kids, white grandmothers, Latino folk, Black folk. There was a melting pot of people who were outraged. And I want to ask anybody who's involved, who saw that, or you saw the events of Kenosha, I want you to take pen to paper to write about your experience, because some people will say, I can't tell that truth, Rev, because I am not Black. My pigment won't allow me to tell that truth. Let me tell you something. When I first came to Oakland, I was standing outside. I was going to do a book signing at the old Barnes and Nobles, which is no longer there, in Jack London Square. And I was handing out flyers, and a woman came up to me, and she began to talk to me, and she was very friendly, maybe a little too friendly. And so I invited her to come to the book sign, and she goes, I've never been to anything like this. I might come. And so I talked about my books. That night I was signing the book straight out of East Oakland. And I had the choir from my church. There was a very unusual book signing. We had a soul food spread, free soul food spread. And at the end of the discussion, I had the Q&A. And then I began to talk in the Q&A. People ask you questions about the book, the process, whatever. The woman was there, and she raised her hand and she said, I am just like one of the characters in your book. She says, I am trapped in human trafficking. The people in the church surrounded her. They embraced her. They hugged on her. When I looked up a few Sundays later and I looked in the choir, there she was. That launched a journey for me, because I began to find out how deeply entrenched human trafficking is in Oakland, especially the trafficking of children. And it led me to start a ministry at the church I was at the time called the Street Disciples. Now you might say, well, how can you do that? You're a man. How can you start a ministry to human trafficking victims and the victims of domestic violence? Just because it doesn't affect your genre, your gender, or your pigment, doesn't mean that we're all not members of the human family. So we need you to write about police abuse. We need you to get involved in this struggle against the mass incarceration plantation institution that's become such the ugly truth about America. Some people say, well, I can't. No, you can't. I wouldn't write American. That doesn't mean write American. What was the name of that book? American Dirt. It doesn't mean write American Dirt, but it does mean from your own perspective that you can educate people who would never listen to me in your own circle. So I would urge you to speak that fearless truth, because you might not change. You don't need to change the whole world, just the people sitting at your dinner table.
I was just going to say that if we stay silent, even within our own families, when we know that something needs to be said, we are part of the problem. It's a great, I love to see challenges as opportunities to be able to transform ourselves. So when people say things that you don't believe in, that really rub you the wrong way, that feel unjust, feel wrong, and you are silent, you're complicit, you're part of the problem. So now is not the time to continue wasting your life by being quiet. So many of us have squandered opportunities where we could have made a difference. And you may not be listened to, and you may not be heard or understood, but don't let that stop you. You may be laughed at, you may be yelled at, you may be ridiculed, but do it anyway. And don't listen to all the reasons why you shouldn't, or what everybody says to you about, oh my God, you're going to get in trouble. Oh, everybody's going to go against you on, social media or whatever. Focus on what you'll gain and do it anyway. When you're older and, your time is coming to move on to whatever the next realm is, you don't want to look back with regrets, and more, you want to look back with pride of what you did to help make the world a better place.
That's absolutely true. So true, Martha. And the other thing I would encourage folk to do is to broaden the area of truth that you would have come to understand. And what I mean by that is to broaden the circle of what you read, of the news information that you avail yourself to, of the people in your circle. Now we've got this time where we can do Zoom, and there are all kinds of meetup groups. Get into some meetup groups with people who might be different than the folk who live in your community.
What a great idea.
Yeah. Read books. I've started a few years ago, I stumbled upon a website called humanrightswatch.com. It might be .org, I forgot. But anyway, it was the organization Human Rights Watch. I think they're centered in San Francisco. But they tell the story on that website of people who are struggling all over the world, because we have a tendency to only think about the truth and the struggle of the people in our neighborhood. And so Malcolm X taught us this, that all the struggles of people worldwide are connected. And I'm following Malcolm's advice to broaden myself so I can tell an even greater truth, that I could get on here one day and talk about not only what's happening in East Oakland, but what's happening in Syria, or what's happening in Suriname, or what's happening, somewhere in North Africa. So we have to broaden what we understand. And many times I find that we only look at and read things that appeal to our small circle.
That's a good point. I love that. Well, I see that we have some questions, and it looks like maybe we've talked for about half an hour. I can't remember when we started, but do you want to look and see what these questions are?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Okay. Absolutely. I hope this is the way we're supposed to do it. Oh, good. Yay, questions. Yes.
Okay.
All right. So I see one from Vivian. Isn't plot and story the same thing? That is to say, our story writes itself if we understand the importance of the message that we are trying to convey.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, that's interesting. I don't know if it's quite that easy, but yeah, I think that we all go about it in our own way. And if you start with your message and your truth and putting it forward, you could get a whole draft of a story, but at some point you do want to get the structure and the plot sort of figured out in a way that's pleasing to your readers. I'm going to be talking about structuring a book tomorrow morning at this time. So that might be a time that you could ask that question again, and we could talk a little bit more about that part.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so here we go. This is from Nina. What's the one thing you must do to courageously speak your truth as a writer to break through your fear and make the difference with your words. Do you want to speak to that?
Sure. Don't self-censor. Don't self-censor. Censor. Don't self-censor.
Nice, nice.
So when what happens is that we start writing something and it becomes a little personal, and we say, "Well, I can't say that, or I can't write that." I'd urge you to write, even if you're not going to use it. Write it. Put it on the paper. Put it on the screen. You can always go back later and say, "Well, I'm not going to use it." But so some of your greatest ideas are erased, and you'll be surprised at how many people will be enlightened or say, I was thinking the exact same thing. So don't self-censor, and look at your writing as something that's going to impact other people, that people need. In the Latino community, they told you that las palabras, they say that's food. They say it's comida. When I talk about, they call it medicine. They call your words. When I say something I have a lot of Latino friends, and they say, "Oh, Rev, that was good medicine." So what you're giving is you're an alchemist in the laboratory cooking up medicine. Just put it out there. Don't let fear stop you from freeing yourself and others.
That's great. And I think that the more you do that, I think the first thing is to whatever the truth is to expose it to the light. Lots of our truths are hidden away, what we believe, but they're not what everybody else does or whatever. So we just sort of think we're different. We hide these things away. We have secrets, whatever it happens to be. And what becomes empowering, and maybe the first step in fearlessness, is what you just said, is to write it. When you write it, it becomes real. You brought it out of your body onto the page. And yes, you can, burn up that paper or shred it or whatever. But just that first step is the step toward healing, and it's a step toward empowering. And the more you do that, the more power you feel within yourselves, because there is nothing to be ashamed of. We are precious human beings that are here for a reason, and there's nothing that should stand in our way. And for me, with the work that I've done with writers and creatives over the years, is that it's not so much the external antagonists or people or things externally from us, but it is our own internal fear, insecurity. I'm not good enough. Oh, who am I to say something? I'm not smart enough. Nobody's going to care. Nobody's going to listen. All those things. And it's what you said, the critic, the self-critic that's just nattering away in your ear, saying, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. But that's when it's most exciting, is to walk into your fear, is to face your fear and see that there's nothing to be afraid of. I mean, we set it up and we cause all these internal problems, whereas it doesn't have to be that way. So yeah, I really support you in getting it onto the page. And if you're not ready for it to be, out there in the world, then sure, cut it. But just the fact of writing it and exposing it to the light is a chance for deep, profound healing and transformation.
Mm-hmm. I see a question here. Somebody said, "Do you?" D'Angelo Thompson says, "Do you find psychology and spirituality a powerful duo in your work and writing, Rev?" I'd like to respond to that.
Yes.
So I minister in a place called I live in East Oakland, in California, and I minister there, but I work at Glide Memorial Church. You can look it up, glide.org. It's a very large church that does a lot of social justice ministry in the San Francisco Tenderloin. And so the people that I work with, if you understand anything about the Tenderloin, it's a drug supermarket. There's crack, methamphetamine, OxyContin. There's powder and pills. You find blood drops stuck to $1 bills because it's an extremely violent place. And so the people that I deal with are in a lot of pain, and many of them have been incarcerated. They have mental health issues or drug issues. And so when I write a book, I'm writing from not only a place of entertainment, but a place where I want to bring spiritual enlightenment and hope into a darkness that's in a place where not many people can get a word of hope through. And so, yeah, my spirituality plays a huge role. My agent is on this line. Lori is my agent.
Mm-hmm.
And I told Lori about a book that I'm going to send to her. It came to me in a dream 20 years ago. And the book was about an inner city pastor who gets into a lot of different issues. The whole book came to me in a dream. I'm going to tell you that the book came from God. And so, Lori, after this conference is over, you're going to get that book. But when you talk about psychology, a lot of people are dealing with PTSD because there's so much violence in the hood. I've talked to people who had their parents murdered, people who have seen things that no child should ever see, people that have been through things. And so I'm looking always to heal through my books or to show people how they can be healers.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I use a lot of spirituality in my work as well, and it's not so much from a traditional religious sort of background, but it's more spirituality, within yourself, to be able to really go deeper into that non-physical part of yourself that's connected to all else, and to be able to be aligned with that in a way that allows you to speak up, speak out, speak back, and be the person that you came here to be. So I think spirituality is a big element of why we are here, and also why maybe we're going through some of these enormous challenges, is that it's an opportunity for us, when a lot of us were sheltering in place, to go inward, to be quiet, to stop the rat race, to stop, running in this busyness that just kept us all so seduced and addicted to, being busy. And I think that there's a lot of good that's coming out of this self-reflection and quiet and, looking at things in a new way, that there's a new paradigm that's emerging. If we could just hold on to it and get enough of us speaking our, fearless truth and holding people accountable and holding ourselves accountable.
You're absolutely right. And especially in these times, these are the times when we really need, the world is at a shaking place. I'm going to tell you this one thing, though. I have never been more optimistic about the hope for racial reconciliation and actually an end to racism than I am right now. We are at a place in history where it can happen.
Wow, that gives me goosebumps.
We're at a place where change is here. The change that my grandmother, her mother before her, would have never even thought possible is here. But what we have to do now is we can't sit back in what Pastor J. Alfred Smith Sr. would have called the rocking chair of lazy religion. And see, when I say religion, I minister to people who are not only Baptists. I'm a Baptist ministering in a Methodist church to people who are Buddhists, some are atheists, Hindu. So I've my idea of spirituality is probably a lot broader than a lot of people's, but we can't. Social justice is at the core essence of all religions, from Christianity to Islam to Buddhism. We all believe that we need to take care of the poor, the least among us. We all believe in justice. And now, after all of these years, we're looking at change, systemic change. The fact that America is for the first time talking about, if I was in church, I'd be shouting right now. The fact that you're talking about systemic change. No, the president says there's no such thing outwardly, but you heard what he said in those tapes to Woodward. He knows there's systemic racism. He said it out of his own mouth in quiet. But now we're in a place where people are confronting that. People are reading Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. It's become the new Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a book called what was the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe's book? That some Lincoln said it was start of the Civil War.
Uncle Tom's Cabin.
There you go. Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in a Time of Colorblindness, is the new Uncle Tom's Cabin. Everybody's reading that. It's freeing a lot of people. This is the time that you and I need to write. If that's writing a book, if it's writing a magazine article, a blog, if it's writing on Facebook, our words have to free people. This is your time as a writer, as an author, as an alchemist of the ballpoint pen, to spur on that moment of freedom. You can do it. You don't have to march. I march. You should see the bottom of my shoes. But you know what? You can do that from behind a computer screen today. So I'm preaching, and I don't want to do that. But I want you to think about what it would bring to bring change through your pen in a time when racism can be eradicated.